Say this universe is like this every time.
We just checking sound throughout the building. We're trying to make sure everybody can enjoy themselves this evening. I thank you all for your patience. Just give me a moment. I'm doing a bunch of mic checks. I'm just gonna keep talking. But feel free, welcome, welcome, welcome. We hope to start the talk in the next 5 minutes. We're just doing our last round of sound check, okay? Hopefully you got food, hopefully you got drink. If you didn't, it's not my fault. If you didn't, there are Busboys and Poets team members throughout the space that are more than happy to help you all this evening, okay? I appreciate your patience. Thank you for coming through tonight. I'm gonna keep mic checking and talking about things until I get a thumbs up. So I thank you guys for joining us tonight at Busboys and Poets, okay? Give us a few moments and we'll be started, okay? Please keep in mind that we need the walkways clear so that everyone can enjoy themselves. Good? See, that's why we do mic checks. Try to not have that I don't know if I'm talking slow or it's a delay. Like a good beat though. I was like, can I drop one? I can't. I'm really bad at things like that. Good. Check. Please keep all walkways clear. It's for our staff. It's for your safety. We ask that you not stand in any doorways. I see all you lovely people by the door. I need you to move. Can we please keep the area clear? If you have an empty seat next to you, can you raise your hand? We got one seat up here. Look at that. Nobody want a third row seat? We got a second row seat. Holding seats, y'all. It's a community seat. For it. Equity. You got here, you got on time, enjoy. Can we please keep doorways clear? Woo. Leave over here. Okay. Woo. Good evening, good evening. Welcome to Busboys and Poets. If you can see me, you're going to see them. So, welcome. If we can keep the doorways clear, please. I ain't do that. Good evening, good evening. Welcome to Busboys and Poets. We will be getting started shortly. Thank you for joining us today at Busboys and Poets. We'll be beginning tonight's discussion and conversation in just a few moments. If there are open seats near you, please raise your hand. You got
So these are those three mics, so we need to make sure
and be on the seat right now or not?
we can, we want to have, so Ms. Davis is the second to you.
Can we move the plant?
Leave them on,
Can
though.
we move the plant? Not.
That's why I wanted to hand it to you. Richard, sir?
Good evening, good evening. Welcome to Busboys and Poets. We're about to get started. I'm gonna ask all lovelies to keep all aisles clear, to clear out the doorway. I see my two lovely people at the door. Let's find you guys seats. If you have open seating, please raise your hand. Oh, that's all. Welcome, we're gonna get seated shortly. Started shortly, you're already seated, hopefully. Yeah. There will be a Q&A portion of the event. We will be walking around with postcards where you can write questions on. We will not be able to get to all questions, but we will collect the questions and select from some of them and ask them. We want to make sure that if you have your book signing card, you can get your signatures. So unfortunately, the Q&A portion won't be too long, but we definitely want to make sure she can engage with you all and we can answer some questions. If you see me after we do announcements and you have a question you'd like to submit, raise your hand and I'll come over to you with the card that you can fill out, okay? That's Angela's mic. That's Angela right there. Can we move the point?
Put the microphone on there.
Now I'm on the stage, you know what's about to happen. Peace and love, peace and love. Welcome to Busboys and Poets. We thank you for joining us today on our 17th anniversary at our newest location in Columbia, Maryland. We thank this community for how you have welcomed us, how you have encouraged Busboys and Poets and our staff. I thank you, I thank you, I thank you. Welcome. We hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation, and peace and love. Please remember to tip your servers.
Greetings, beautiful people. How's everybody feeling tonight? I said, how's everybody feeling tonight? We got Angela Davis in the building? What? It's about to go down. My name is Charity Blackwell. I'm the director of poetry events here at Busboys and Poets, and I just wanted to open up. Can I do a poem for y'all real quick? Is that cool? All right, awesome. So this poem is dedicated to my mother, Mary Blackwell. I learned that after her passing that I've learned a lot of lessons through memories. And I like to think that she's taught me my more gentle, caring, giving side. So this poem's actually dedicated to her. My mother was a Cancer, super loving, giving. Any Cancers in the building? Y'all are cool. I like you. Father was a Scorpio. Yeah, they hate us. I'm Scorpio myself. Kind of the opposite of my mother, but it was interesting how they were able to balance each other out. So, poem's called The Gift of Giving, dedicated to Mary Blackwell. My mother used to tell me, Charity, you should give. You should give and never question and never expect a dime in return. She said that giving is something that cannot be measured. Matter of fact, it's a treasure, something like a gift, because the gift of giving is an ancient tradition, a tradition as an extension from our ancestors' centuries and centuries of feeling helplessness while still graciously displaying selflessness. She said, baby, this world will eat you alive and tear away at your soul. So diligently and intentionally give the most when you feel whole. Trust me, I know she would tell me how our ancestors gave us hope when they escaped to the north, how Rosa gave us resilience when she refused to move, how James Brown gave us pride when he said, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, and the vibrant joy he gave us, the way he shuffled and jived over racism. You'll tell me about Malcolm and Martin, how they gave us strength and patience, calm yet anxious, how Langston paved the pathway to us exploring our biggest, richest, most ambitious dreams. You'll tell me how the Obama's nomination gave us validation that yes, we can, and yes, we did. You and Pops did not see eye to eye on everything. I remember what you said to him that day when he asked you, as you rolled the windows down, arms extended like the branches of a giving tree, green leaves falling into the hands of the homeless man. He asked you, sweetheart, why do you give them money? You know what they're gonna do with it. You know what it's gonna go towards. You know we really don't owe them anything. You would sigh and reply, my love, who are we to judge? Because you understood that what it means to give is the epitome of what it means to live. To live is to serve is to pay it forward in honor of ones before. She said that giving is something that cannot be measured. Matter of fact, it's a treasure. Something like a gift, because the gift of giving is an ancient tradition, a tradition as an extension from our ancestors. So I give like my life depends on it, as if my ancestors gave me the keys to the chains that unlock the block freedom that flows through my veins, as if Rosa gave me a seat at the front of the bus in the Jim Crow Ku Klux Montgomery heat, as if James Brown gave me his feet, choreographed my every move to continue to prove that even resilience can be wielded with a two-step Motown groove, as if Langston helped me snooze, manifested my dreams, as Langston helped me snooze, manifested my dreams, gave me the beams of light and darkness that burst at the seams, as if my mother named me Charity, which means love, or the acts of giving to those in need, as if it's apparent that my parents gave me the foundation to serve, to observe the absurd, and give back to those who deserve more love than what the world's given them, because life's thrown them to the curse. So I bless them with these hands, this knowledge, or these words, so I give like my future depends on it. Even if giving takes its toll, because you said, baby, this world will eat you alive and tear away at your soul. So diligently and intentionally give the most when you feel whole, because receiving something in return should never be your goal. Trust me, I know, trust me, I know, trust me, I know.
That was Charity Blackwell. Give her another hand. Now, I think we're the only restaurant in the world that has a director of poetry events. And we call them our dope. Director of poetry events. You get it? And she is that, indeed. How are y'all doing? It's great. We had an event last night with Angela Davis and Alicia Garza over at an Acaste location. And the crowd was amazing, as always. Our crowds are amazing. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. I know a lot of you, we're about community, about creating safe spaces for people to come here and break bread together and hopefully change the world. If you're sitting with someone you don't know, make sure you introduce yourself sometime during the night. I think it'd be a nice thing. I think people want to come here and meet people. I think we're all hungry for that. We learned that during COVID. The separation doesn't always work. And I'm glad we're all back together here again for this incredible event. Today, of course, is a momentous day for us. It's our anniversary. Busboys and Poets is now 17 years old. We're 17 years old. We opened our doors back on September 7th, 2005, at the height of the Iraq War. Being an Iraqi myself, it was a very important time for me to open a place where people can come together and be able to talk about important issues. And it really kind of helped me restore my faith in America at some level, because I saw so many people who believed in peace and justice and all the wonderful things that you all in this room believe in. So thank you. Thank you all so much. And I have to tell this story every time because I know that some of you may not know Busboys and Poets is named after the great poet Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, of course, one of our preeminent poets, probably the best known poet in the United States, certainly in the 20th century. Langston Hughes was born in 1902 in Missouri. He ended up moving to Washington, D.C. to find work and ended up working as a busboy at the age of 22 at the Wardman Park Hotel. So one momentous night in 1924, he happened to be working there. There was a poetry conference that was taking place in the hotel with a very famous poet then named Vaughn Lindsay. The young Langston Hughes put some of his poetry in front of Vaughn Lindsay's plate, hoping that Vaughn Lindsay would recognize him. The next day on his way to work, Langston Hughes picks up the newspaper and it says, Vaughn Lindsay had discovered a busboy poet. And suddenly that became his kind of known thing. When he got to the hotel, there was a lot of photographers waiting to take his pictures, and he ended up leaving there and becoming probably more prolific as a poet than anybody else that we have, I think, in America. And he has written literally hundreds of poems, and we have anthologies of him and so on. So he is our muse. He is someone that we look up to. He's someone that I can relate to because I understand the issues that he has dealt with then and the issues that we continue to deal with today, issues of racism, social justice, and all the things that we all have to pay attention to these days. So thank you again. And of course, when I was thinking of our anniversary, I couldn't think of anybody else than Angela Davis and Gina Dent to be here. Friends, people that I admire, people that I highly respect. And our anniversary would not be complete without them. So it's great to have them. And of course, having someone that is of a high caliber individual who is able to interview them, I called on April Ryan. April Ryan. We loved watching you at the White House when you were sparring with that, whatever he was. Thank you. April Ryan is a CNN political analyst and the award-winning Washington, D.C. bureau chief and senior White House correspondent at the Griot. April is the longest-serving Black woman reporter in the White House press corps. Sadly enough, she is one of only 3 African Americans in the association's over 100-year history to serve on its board. but we're happy you are there. She is also the author of several books, including Under Fire, which she speaks about her time at the White House when she ended up, having some issues with the guy, and soon to be released, her book, which we're going to do a launch right here in one of our locations, Black Women Will Save the World, an anthem. The Black women agree, it looks like. And I think all the rest of us as well. We need you guys. So I'm going to introduce our two very special guests today. I'm going to read it from here because this is a real academic piece, but it really speaks to issues that are really significant to all of us and things that we can all relate to. I'm going to speak, first of all, Gina Dent is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, and Legal Studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. She is the editor. Wait a minute, her bio is much longer than that. Okay, she is the editor of Black Popular Culture and Lectures and Writes on African Diaspora, Literary and Cultural Studies, Post-Colonial Theory, and Critical Area Studies. You can tell having breakfast with her is really fun, I have to say. Having wonderful conversations. Her current project, Visualizing Abolition, grows out of her work as an advocate for transformative and transitional justice and prison abolition. Thank you so much for being here, Gina. Come on in. I apologize, yeah, my back. Thank you for having my back, Gina, literally. And of course, last but not least, we have Angela Davis. She is Professor Emerita of History and Consciousness of Feminist Studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. She's an activist, a writer, a lecturer, a philosopher. Her work focuses on prisons, police abolition, and the related intersections of race, gender, and class. She's been talking about intersectionality way before it became a thing. She is the author of many books, from Angela Davis, an autobiography, to Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And I urge you to pick up these books. And there's a new version of her autobiography that just came out with a very nice foreword that brings us up to date. So I urge you to take it, and her writing is really quite spectacular. So thank you so much, Angela, for coming and sharing this day with us.
Good evening, Columbia. Wasn't me. Good evening, Columbia, Maryland, Busboys and Poets. How you feeling tonight? For us to come out in the rain, to see and hear these great women, you can give it up a little bit better than that. How you feeling tonight? House rules, we engage in here. This is a moment to talk about movement, to talk about intersectionality, to talk about activism, and most importantly, feminism, from two of the greatest that are on the front line and have been on the front line. What to do is encourage each and every one of you to get a card. If you have a card, write the question out. I will read it as long as it's legible. And my old 55-year-old eyes can read it. I just turned 55 Monday. Yay for me. Won't he do it? So first of all, thank you for joining us, and we're going to start this great conversation. Dr. Angela Davis and Dr. Dent. Dr. Davis, I want to start with you. You know, we talk about intersectionality so much. And then when it comes to issues of feminism and other subjects like prisons, people are like, where's the intersection there? Could you explain to us first what the intersectionality is with the prison system and feminism?
Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you so much, April, for agreeing to facilitate this conversation. Now, the question you just asked me would require a very long and complicated answer if we had the time.
We're here for your synopsis, though, of a synopsis. That's right.
So, you know, first of all, I think it's important to make the point that we're not talking about any kind of feminism. We're not talking about what we often describe as glass ceiling feminism. Glass ceiling feminism indicates that the person is already at the very top and only needs to push through the ceiling. And my friend Michael Bennett, the former football player for Seattle Seahawks, said, I'm not that concerned about the women who are at the top of the ladder already. I'm concerned with those who are underneath the floor. So we're talking about a feminism that is anti-racist, a feminism that is anti-capitalist, a feminism that has a long history among Black women, among Latina women, among working class women. And that is the way in which we see the connection with prison issues. Prisons have always claimed the lives of Black people, other people of color, poor people. Now, that would be one way to begin an answer, and I'm going to also propose another way briefly.
Okay.
And that is to think about issues that concern women and gender non-conforming people, sexual abuse.
Gender violence.
Gender violence, absolutely. And the assumption is often made that in order to address gender violence, we need to deploy the punishment system. We need carceral solutions. We need to lock up all of those who are responsible for assaulting women, including trans women and gender nonconforming people. And we argue that that only further complicates and aggravates the problem. So in order for us to think about eradicating what is the most pandemic form of violence in the world, we need to think about the kinds of solutions that are not enabled by prisons and other forms of incarceration, but rather by changing the society, by changing the world. And that is what abolition is all about. Abolition is about revolution in all spheres. It's about creating a world that no longer needs to rely on prisons and police and other forms of punitive activity. That's I have about 3 or 4 other approaches, but I'm going to stop right here. So.
And I'm quite sure we'll probably touch on them in this conversation. Dr. Dent, can you expound on that?
Well, sure. First of all, hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here for the anniversary. And so my mic is...
I'm turning it on. Let me just borrow. We're just going to share. Okay, better, right? Yeah. It's wonderful to be here to help celebrate the anniversary. This is our first time in Columbia, and honestly, first time in DC in over 3 years because of the pandemic. So I'm thrilled to see all of you and thrilled to be here, and thank you. So
I guess I'll just say that that's the reason we wrote the book. This book is a collective project of 4 authors. 2 of them are not here today, so I will lift up our colleagues Beth Ritchie and Erica Miners. Wonderful activists and professors in Chicago whom we've known for decades. And all of us have been involved in prison abolition work and in feminist work for all of that time, since I guess the 90s when we came to know each other, and some of us before. And that work always made us feel like we were on the edges of conversations. We'd be in an abolition framework doing organizing or at a conference, and there were problems that were not being addressed. So for example, people didn't want to talk about women in prison because they would say, well, so few women are in prison, which meant there was no gender analysis of the prison. Or we'd be in a feminist environment where, as Angela was pointing out, people would be talking about a kind of glass ceiling feminism, like we need to have someone represent us in whatever field it is, or someone should get a higher salary who already was making millions of dollars. And that doesn't seem like much of a concern to us. Why don't we care about the incredible acceleration, especially in working class and Black and women of color going to prison, right? Why are we not thinking about the prison itself as a gendering institution that helps to reproduce the violence of gender in our society? So this book was really to say, what if we put our perspectives at the center? What if we started to say, how can we look again at the whole system of incarceration and the prison industrial complex, which is a larger framework that includes thinking about racial capitalism and thinking about gender violence and thinking about other things? What if we put that at the center and tried to have a conversation that started from us rather than having us enter from the end?
Thank you, Dr. Dent. The prison system in our nation is a multi-billion-dollar business at the very least. And you just brought up something about incarceration and gender violence, which is very interesting. It begs me to ask the question, are you looking for more of a holistic approach to punishment versus incarceration? Could you speak on that?
I think the mic is on. It seems like it got a little bit better as you were speaking. It was a little less distorted, right? Okay, so, you know, we often use the term prison industrial complex because we want to urge people to think about the work, the terrible work that that institution does in contexts other than prisons themselves. And of course, we know that with some 2 million people behind bars in this country, the vast majority of whom are people of color, we know that there is so much amazing intellectual, creative energy. As a matter of fact, as I was saying last night, and sometimes I really try to imagine this, if we would just open the doors to all of open the gates of all of the prisons in this country, the sisters and brothers and other siblings, trans people inside, would be able to help us solve some of the major social problems of our time. So we conceptualize carceral issues much more broadly than the specific institution of the prison. We know that it affects the way we relate to each other, those of us who inhabit the free world. We know that that we sometimes do the ideological work of the state when we internalize these impulses to punish, when we have problems with other people, and our first instinct is to punish them, to get back at them, to do something bad to them. So it really is about thinking not only about the institutions of imprisonment and policing, but about changing the society we live in. It's about education, it's about schools, it's about healthcare, it's about mental health care.
Jobs.
It's definitely about jobs. I always say it's about free education. Everyone in this country should have the right to get an education however far they want to go without having to buy it. Education should not be a commodity. So all of these issues are related to the struggle against the prison industrial complex.
And that somewhat goes back to the holistic approach. Dr. Dent?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think what we're arguing is that the kind of feminism that we've been engaged in, whether it goes by that name or not, because we're not terribly concerned about whether or not someone has an organization where they say that they're feminist or not.
Hello. All right. We're not so concerned about whether or not people say they're feminist. It's not about the labels. What we're trying to do is pay attention to the history of what we characterize as feminist labor that has gone into the abolition movement, but that is likely to be disappeared from the history of that movement, which is, one, a consequence of people not getting credit for the work they've done, but more importantly, could mean that we're not really addressing the full problem. So what would it mean, for example, and we've seen this when we talk about the civil rights era, or when we talk about the 19th century abolitionist struggle against slavery, all the movements where we have to keep going back and saying, oh, there were women there. There were these feminist activities. They weren't called feminist, doesn't matter. They were concerned with problems of gender and problems of violence and problems of people being left out. If we have to always go back and redress by rewriting those histories and then having to learn those lessons again, and then never having really solved the full problem because we've omitted certain kinds of people or certain kinds of questions or certain kinds of ways of being, then we're really not doing the work politically that we should be doing. So this book is really about saying it isn't that feminism should be added later or could be added later to abolition. It's that you cannot have an abolitionist project that isn't feminist if it's really going to deeply affect all the structures of life. So the politics of care, right? Who does care work, right? Who does all kinds of other invisible labor? And of course, we're not talking only about women in the United States or gender non-conforming people, we're talking about the world, because we don't have a prison industrial complex just in the United States. So there are other elements that we were trying to introduce into the book, and we're academics, we're used to doing this. We go from one thing to another thing, and people are like, wait, I'm still stuck on that last thing. But the point for us is that you really can't understand the system without being as big in your thinking as the system. And the prison industrial complex affects all of us in so many ways. And of course, the more vulnerable people in our society are affected the most. So if we really want to care about those forms of vulnerability, then we have to actually build a movement from the ground up that takes seriously the experiences of all of the people who have been incarcerated, who've been telling us that this is not a cure for social harms, but it is actually exacerbating those harms. So if we want a holistic way of approaching remaking society, we have to start with the prison industrial complex.
That's powerful. And in this book, Abolition, Feminism Now, You say restorative justice is harmful, and let me go to page, for those of you who have the book already, page 34, at the bottom of page 34, moving into page 35. This study was taken in the 1970s. The American Friends Service Committee published Struggle for Justice, a report on crime and punishment in America. The concluding section of this report emphasized, among other issues, opposition for the construction of new prisons. The report argued that, as a reform, modern prisons may relieve the harsher physical hardships of doing time, but the essential punitive element of prison, deprivation of liberty and free choice remains. When pressures for reform lead to demand to relieve overcrowding by adding new cell or bed space, the result is inevitable. The corrosive net of justice system will be spread over a large number of people, entrapping them for longer periods of time. If prisons are overcrowded, ways should be found to cut back the mass of criminal laws and the types of enforcement that send so many people to prison. The construction of new prisons is not compatible with our view of the proper role of criminal law in a democratic society. So that goes to your point that restorative justice is hurtful. That was in the 70s. Let's fast forward to 2022. Fast forward to 2022 when we're still dealing with issues of policing, issues of prison reform, issues of sentencing reform. Can you say crack cocaine versus powder? All right. See, but it's real. And we're also dealing, once again, with policing. And you say in the book, arresting, indicting one police officer does not change the system. So let's dig in there, Dr. Davis.
Yeah, thank you for reading that passage, because one of the points we try to make in the book is that there have been radical struggles against prisons for a very long time. As a matter of fact, if we remember that the very institution of the prison as a major form of punishment, that in the invention of the prison coincides with capitalism, with the emergence of capitalism. And as a matter of fact, if you think about the fact that what the prison is supposed to do is to deprive people of their rights and liberties, right? I mean, that's the conception of punishment.
And correct the behavior, correct the bad behavior, supposedly.
Well, yes. And that's another issue. But if you think, the point I want to make is that prisons are only a major form of punishment in so-called democratic societies. What I call bourgeois democratic societies, by the way. Because it's only in those societies that people are expected to enjoy rights and liberties. So as much as we think about the prison as a kind of holdover of non-democratic societies, that is not the case. It relies on the kind of democracy we are accustomed to thinking about in this country. I love democracy, and I think we need democracy. I just don't think that capitalist democracy works. Capitalist democracy is really an oxymoron. But anyway, so we were talking about the fact that prisons deprive people of their rights and liberties. And April, you pointed out that they're supposed to correct as well. The very first prisons in this country were created by the Quakers. And you read a passage from a report that was issued by the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. The Quakers invented the prison as we know it because they thought it would be a reform. They thought that if people could be imprisoned instead of tortured and instead of killed, by the way, the prison was supposed to be an alternative to the death penalty. We see that did not happen because the death penalty is still with us. But the prisons that they created were based on solitary confinement. And so if you look at these structures like Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, oh well, so I'm starting to echo now. They realized, the Quakers realized, actually, as a matter of fact, pretty quickly, that their conception of solitary that would lead people to reform themselves. In a way, it was patterned after monasteries and places where religious people have the opportunity to meditate and to think about themselves. But as Charles Dickens pointed out in 1833, under those conditions, people were going insane. And so early on, it became apparent that the kind of punishment that relies on imprisonment was not going to work. Yet, here we are in the 21st century, and we're still dealing with prisons. Let me just point out that Michel Foucault argued that the very history of the prison is a history of attempts to reform the prison. So, all of the attempts to reform prisons have only led to more repressive institutions, and now, of course, we not only have the categories of I'm thinking about minimum security, right? And then there's medium security, and then there's maximum security. And just recently, in the last 2 decades, we have super maximum security. So I can imagine that if we continue along this way, we're going to have super, extra super maximum security, and on and on. These institutions do not work.
And that is the recidivism rate continues to climb. That goes to your point.
Could I add a timely story about this? We talk about these issues so often that sometimes we forget some basics. In 2000, Angela and I were part of a research group in California.
I'm wondering if it's because we are something, but go ahead.
Intently.
And we did visits to prisons in California for about 3 months with a research group. And on one of the visits, all the visits, we have to get permission to go in. We're being escorted by the prison staff, so all the guards are there. And there are 2 stories that I like to tell that really help us to think about some of these problems. And one is about classification. There was a warden who was walking us through one of the prisons, and he talked about how they had to change the classifications for some of the people who were inside. And he said, well, prisoners conform to their classification. Here's what he meant by that. Whatever you said, if you say you have a super maximum and you set people up and you say they're super violent and you only let them out of their cells for 1 hour a day, guess how people are going to act? Guess how they're going to feel? If you let someone have yard privileges or be released on the weekend or have a job that means something to them, guess how they're going to act? This was a way where he was trying to say to us, we know what we're doing, we know how to create control. But from our point of view, this was him admitting that these were all unnecessary. That in fact, if you created conditions where people could be kind to each other, where they could learn, where they could get drug treatment, where they could have help with childcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we would have a different society. The second thing I want to say is, one of the things this book is about is all the ways that we have internalized the carceral thinking. And so when we were going into one part of the prison, which was the Supermax area, they offered our research group bulletproof vests. And some members of our group started to we were slapping people's hands, don't grab that vest. And we said, unless you're gonna shoot us, and you're the only ones who have weapons, we don't think we need the bulletproof vest. But the point about it is that you have to think, because the way we're trained to think is that everything's for our safety. If someone gives you a vest, you put it on. I mean, I'm not saying you, but we do this social. So unlearning the habits of carcerality are so much a part of this. And for us, that's a deeply feminist project. It's really about relationality. It's rethinking the whole way we are with each other. And these are some of the themes that were really important to us in doing the book.
Dr. Davis, this work is not new to you. You've done projects on this before, and you've had personal experience, House D, being an activist, and you were incarcerated. Could you talk to us about the linkage between this work that has been a part of your life from your time in House D?
Thank you, April, for asking me to reflect on those connections. As a matter of fact, before I was arrested and went into, that was the first jail, the Women's House of Detention in New York, and then the Marin County Jail, and then after that, a jail in San Jose. The reason I ended up in jail was because I was doing work around jails and prisons. And I've been doing that a long time. And as a matter of fact, I can remember, my work was primarily focused on freeing political prisoners. I was working on a number of cases involving members of the Black Panther Party, George Jackson, and I can remember speaking to people around that time, appealing to them passionately to support these brothers who were behind bars, because we did not know who would be the next target of political repression. I had no idea I was talking about myself. But I'm so glad I was doing that work, because all of those people I had appealed to support the campaign to free the Soledad brothers got involved in the campaign to free Angela Davis. But when I was in jail, I corrected my committee that had named himself National United Committee to Free Angela Davis, and I had to tell them that we cannot forget about all of the others. And so it became the National United Committee to Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And then, precisely as a result of that work, we became aware of the fact that it wasn't just about the political prisoners that we knew as political prisoners at that time, but it was also about all of those who were behind bars, who were victims of structural racism, of a racist system. And many people are not aware of the fact that George Jackson, for example, was talking about and writing about the way in which prison served as an example of what we now call structural racism. So I think it's important to make those connections because we would not be where we are now in terms of our understanding of the role that mass incarceration plays, the role of the healthcare system, the school system, and all of the other examples of structural racism. And it seems to me it took us about 50 years 50 years to figure out that racism is not an individual flaw. It's not an individual defect, because for all of those years, we focused on trying to correct individuals when the real problems reside in our social and political and economic structures, structural racism.
And you know that structure, as Shirley Chisholm said in 1972, for women, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And now women are at the table, we own the table, we are leading the table, right? But she also said being black and a woman is a double whammy. Well, hello, overflow, I can't hear you. All right. I'm just talking about the overflow. I wasn't talking about this room. Now in this room, I can't hear you. All right, there you go. Call and response like the church. Come on now. I need my prayer cloth too right now. So I want to ask this question, and this is a safe space. This is a safe space. How many of you know someone who is or has been incarcerated? I'm gonna go deep. But this is a safe space because I want to hear from all of you in these cards and these questions that we're gonna receive and answer. How many of you have been incarcerated in this room? Okay, all right. It's important that we're all here tonight to hear this conversation, because movements are led when you are so moved for change. Movements are so led when you are moved to change. And these are change agents right here with this wonderful book, Abolition, Feminism, Now. I want to go to something, and I wish we had more time because, look, Dr. Davis was very concerned. She's like, I want to make sure she read the book. She came in, she saw my tabs. I needed more tabs for this because I ran it, look, like with Obama, I was like, I need more tabs, but that book was long. This one is good. I'm not trying, look, I am not throwing shade on the former president. He just got his beautiful portrait up in the White House today. He and former First Lady Michelle Obama, but wait a minute, how about this? 4 years overdue. We're gonna talk about that one later. But anyway, see how they do us? All right, it's page, for those of you who have your book, we're gonna talk about something that's very important. I see a lot of allies here. Allyship. That's important because a lot of people always say, well, what do you do? What do we do? What can we do when there's a George Floyd moment, when there's a Freddie Gray moment, hello Baltimore in the house? When there's so many, when there's an Ahmaud Arbery, when there's Breonna Taylor, say her name, people always say, what can we do? I want to read page 162. This was so poignant. And it's down towards the bottom. The Chicago Police Department even has an Office of Restorative Justice Strategies, complete with its own Twitter feed. All right. Co-occupation can mean professionalization, intimately tethered with whiteness, and the disqualification of those who have been doing this work effectively without credentials or pay, and the reformation of movements and mutual aid into social service agencies and charities. Professionalization can also individuate by rejecting collectives and community commodifying and privatizing skills, knowledge, and sometimes histories. For example, I'm going to give you a chance to give that example. For example, Dr. Dent.
So you want an example of the co-optation or the alternatives?
I want both. I want you to.
Let's just talk about something that is always coming up, and it's been the center of a lot of conversation in our world, which is the Violence Against Women Act, which was part of the omnibus crime bill, and which I think a lot of people. Joe Biden, but we won't talk about that right this second. We can, but yes, author Joe Biden. Yeah, no, this is really important though. I think as people identified as women, we are often told that these things that are proffered as protection are, the things that are there for us. And one of the things that we've been struggling with the most is the legacy of this crime bill. I don't think it's ironic, or that's not the right word. I don't think it's a coincidence that Carol Moseley Braun, our first Black woman senator from Chicago, was one of the co-authors of this bill. Why would a Black woman in that political position feel forced to align herself with the law and order rhetoric and be coming from a community that people say is riddled with violence, right? See, these characterizations about communities and these characterizations about who we are, especially as Black women in certain kinds of positions and what we're supposed to do are part of the story. But, that bill, as it continues to get reauthorized, always raises questions. And one of the things that was pointed out many years ago when we were involved in the early days of Critical Resistance, which is an organization to fight the prison industrial complex, some people in here know, yay, Critical Resistance, was to say that we should look at the ways that we are invited into fortifying the criminal justice system through these other developing areas that are proffered as protections for us. And so one of the things that I teach law and other issues, and one of the things I always do is have my students read those bills and look at the various things that are where money is going. And so when it comes to VAWA, for example, it's not that community organizations fighting gender violence were getting this money, but often police departments and other agencies that are federal were getting resources ostensibly to train them to do certain work or to have people come to them for more so that their footprint is expanded in our environment rather than reduced. So the very people who are suffering the most under these systems are being invited to think of them as protection. But it's really hard, just like not saying I accept that flak jacket or bulletproof vest, not saying I want the protection is actually hard. Because how do you do it? How do you figure out when you're in a situation how to respect, as in the words of Avia Sarah Day, who just has a new book coming out called Abolition, Revolution, and her co-author, Shanice, and I'm forgetting her last name right now, but I'll get it. They say crime is a construct, but harm is real. Crime is a social construct. In other words, what we characterize as crime, what we fight, look, white-collar crime, let's just talk about it. Capitalism, crime all around, if I'm looking at it. But what we characterize as crime is a social construct. We decide as a society what we're going to label crime and what we're going to criminalize and what we're going to do about it. But harm is real. So as abolition feminists, people think we're just pie in the sky, we're just ignoring everything. We're not ignoring the damage. We're paying attention to the damage where it really is and saying if you want to deal with the real harm, then you have to be abolitionist. You have to understand that there's no way to remediate the system by, for example, changing VAWA every certain number of years by adding new categories. You add trans people, you add indigenous folks. They keep dressing it up, but it's still more policing, more punishment, and less safety.
And before we go any further, Dr. Davis, you wanna add to that. Dr. Davis wants to add to that. But I also, in your comments, I need you to break it down for us. What is an abolitionist? Give us the layman's term definition that you use, because I know you're academicians, and sometimes you're very cerebral.
Well, I think it's important to have conversations about complicated issues, and not everyone has to be an academic to understand complex issues. As a matter of fact, one of the problems is that issues that are very complicated are so often represented as simple and simplistic, so that when we think about crime, we immediately make the jump to punishment. And we think about punishment as existing in order to address crime, whereas punishment is a function of racism, it's a function of class issues, and so many other things. So, one of the things we talked about doing early on, and I'll use a term that is an academic term, but I'll break it down, about disarticulating crime and punishment. And that means pulling them apart and not always thinking that one follows the other, not always thinking that punishment is a function of crime. Because the whole history of this country reveals that it's a function of race. It's a function of class. But April, one of the points that I wanted to make in this conversation, because we often begin this conversation thinking about the US, and the US is the country, the nation that offered the institution of the prison to the world as punishment. We forget that in this world of global capitalism, that U.S. practices of mass incarceration have been exported and are on the international assembly line, so to speak. So we have the same issues now in Brazil, in Colombia, all over Africa. And one of the interesting things is that during the uprisings in response to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there were uprisings in South Africa too. There were calls for defunding the police in South Africa. Now, in South Africa, police are primarily black, right? But they have failed to excise, if it's possible, the structural racism. So even though you have black police officers, we're talking about policing that reflects the old apartheid system. And so what I want to do is to make sure we think about the rest of the world, because we're so accustomed to thinking only about the US. We imagine ourselves as the center of the world. And the other day when Biden gave his speech about fascism, what was the opposite? It was the idea of America and the idea of democracy that America has given to the world. And what we're talking about has come precisely from the capitalist notion of democracy that has been a part of the history of the United States of America from the very beginning. And to use a term that Rat Brown, or to sort of adopt a term that he used when he said violence is as American as apple pie.
How about that?
I think we can say exactly the same thing about prisons and punishment and structural racism and how the US is polluting the entire world with these institutions.
Powerful, right? Dr. Dent?
I just didn't want to forget the other part of your question, because there are two sides, right? There's a part about how hard it is to not be connected to carcerality, but there's also the part about what to do, which I think a lot of people have questions about. So I just wanted to say that we try to lift up a number of organizations in the book. A lot of the book is about the history of organizations, but also about the different kinds of methods that people use to address the harm. So I did say the harm is real, but I also want to say that you can't address the harm individually. And so never are we asking for people to suffer alone with no redress for the harms that are happening to them. What we're trying to do is spread the word about the various ways that people are organizing together to recognize that actually getting involved with what is known as the criminal justice system, but we call the criminal legal system, because it doesn't usually produce any justice, is that people have to be able to have systems in place to address the forms of violence that are, pandemic. But when we involve ourselves in the criminal legal system often, and I think a lot of us probably in this room know this, we're probably survivors of assault, survivors of other things, and when we address those things in our lives, we're usually trying to figure out whether or not it's worth it to report, whether or not the police will be any help, whether or not they will make our households unsafe in other ways, whether or not they'll make our communities unsafe in other ways. So the organizations that we try to lift up, like Survived and Punished and many others that we list, there we go, are organizations that are really working at that problem and really saying, we can build this ourselves. Not only we are building this ourselves. We've been doing this. And people in poor communities have been doing this for a long time. Yesterday we were in Anacostia, which is my family's historical home. It's where my great-great-grandparents were, my great-grandparents were, my grandparents were. And I remember all the stories that my parents told me about living under segregation, right? So yeah, you didn't have access to certain things, but you also had a system in place where people were taking care of each other. Same thing when we're talking about slavery. It's not just being abused, it's all the other things people were doing to organize and be connected and find ways of being human with each other. So what we're trying to lift up in the book are all the ways that people are doing that so that we're not suffering alone and not suffering in silence.
I also want to point out that in writing this book, we wanted to be particularly attentive to the work that groups that are not usually recognized have done. So we wanted to be attentive to the work that the trans community has done to reveal the nature of this carceral system, the work that queer activists in general have done, the work that women have done. And as I love the title of your next book. Black women are saving the world.
Yes, and you are one of them.
Well,
no, you are.
But what's important is that no individual by herself or by themselves can do anything significant. So I always have to point out that nothing that I have ever done has been my own, has been because of my knowledge or my insight as an individual. It's always been within community, within collectives. And that's the way change is made in the world.
A couple things before we go to questions. You're absolutely right. One of the greatest abolitionists, Grandma Moses, who was that? Harriet Tubman. One of the greatest abolitionists. And she brought the masses up north. Collective. She looked for the collective. And there were allies with her. There were people who helped her get through different states. She wasn't alone on the Underground Railroad. She had other people helping her in different passageways and different things. Also, in this book, this great book, it talks about things like the immigration system. Can you say what we were just so upset about, last year? The reins used as whips against our Haitian brothers and sisters? And how people are deported or kept, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This book talks about so much, and I'm gonna leave you with this and we'll go to questions. This different thinking is now here. What used to be the construct of the nation, it used to be the Ivy Leaguers who were in charge. It used to be certain groups who were in charge of every dynamic of this nation. But can you say HBCUers? Seriously, the Ivy Leagues now are making way for Howard University, for Morehouse, for Tougaloo. Benny Thompson, who was the head of the January 6th Select Committee, who could possibly find some stuff on the former president, Tougaloo. Can you say Cedric Richmond, Morehouse? And can you say the Vice President of the United States, Howard University? Black people are now in position to make change. This is a moment, as they're talking about, when you talk about change, look at the people who are there, who come from a community and understand. Will they do it? We don't know. But this is the moment that Angela Davis fought for, that Dr. King fought for. You talked about the March on Washington. We just had the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington. How can you say the March on Washington without talking about Bayard Rustin? So everyone in their different space and place is a change agent. So let's go to questions right now. Enough of me talking. What ways can you suggest that educators use to avoid recreating cancel structures within the school setting? Cancel structures like okay, who asked the question?
Canceling kids, like canceling kids?
No, carceral, like.
Oh, I'm sorry, carceral. Okay, okay.
Carceral, got it.
Carceral, yeah. You said carceral, and I'm
Got it.
repeating right for what you said. All right. Carceral structures, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we often forget about the fact that we're not just talking about specific institutions like jails and prisons and juvenile justice centers, but we're talking about schools. We're talking about the invasion of our educational systems by the representatives of the state, police. What do they call them? School resource officers? And why do we assent to these euphemisms? You know, abolition, you asked me to define abolition, which I haven't yet done, but I didn't forget about the question. But it involves, in the first place, removing school resource officers, removing cops from our schools. As we have already done in Oakland, California. Is Oakland in the house? You know, so often people say, and we've said it ourselves, that education is the alternative to incarceration. As a matter of fact, early on, we had groups called Education, Not Incarceration, Schools, Not Jails, against the school to prison pipeline. But we have to also recognize that the schools have been polluted by this punishment ideology. So we can't assume that the schools, like they are by themselves, are going to be the best alternative, but we have to transform the schools as well. So abolition is a holistic project. Abolition is a, may I say it, revolutionary project. It is about changing the world. It is about radically transforming our societies, and every single institution that reflects the structural racism and the class bias and the heteropatriarchy of our society.
I never imagined in my lifetime I'd be sitting with Angela Davis. How about that? Revolutionary project. Can you say it with me, class? Revolutionary project. I'm glad to see you laugh.
Could we just talk about school, though, for a minute more? Because, you know, one of the things we did with Critical Resistance in the early days was also had this Go to Prison Week. One of our campaigns was Go to Prison Week, which didn't mean we wanted all of our friends to get arrested or anything. What it meant was we wanted people to find ways to get inside of a prison while they were doing whatever they normally did. And a lot of them were school teachers. And the idea is that, you know, if you've never been inside of prison, either as someone who's incarcerated or as someone who has a family member or to visit or as an attorney, and actually even then, you don't see too much if you're an attorney, that's a whole other story. You don't really have a sense that of what it's like. In fact, one of the areas that I work on, that's why I do this Visualizing Abolition project, is all the ways we come to think about jails and prisons because of the TV and film we consume, which doesn't tell us really anything about what's going on. But we invited people to go in and spend time inside of some place near them, to offer a class, to try to just make a visit, so that we could break that boundary, that border. And I'm just saying this because I want to lift up all the different kinds of strategies that we can use to get people, first of all, from being afraid. We're going on a prison visit tomorrow. I mean, this is something we do all the time. It's something that we have a right to do, and that we should do to protect the people who are inside as much as we can and be in solidarity.
Here's another question, and this kind of goes to what you were just saying. College is often touted as the, quote, great equalizer, but we know this is often not the case, especially for many Black and brown people. How can the broken education system be fixed? What are the steps required?
We teach like whole classes on this that go on for weeks and weeks. I'm gonna give it to you in a second. But I will say one thing, because this came up when you called us academicians, which I'm always like a little cringy. I mean, I love what I do.
You are a doctor at a university.
Okay, that's fine. But I don't think it means I can't talk to people. And one of the things that I worry about in this country in particular, that I notice in contradistinction when I'm in other countries in the world, is that certain kinds of conversations are perceived as too academic. And whereas in other parts of the world we travel in, Africa, South America, Europe, Australia, we've been New Zealand, wherever, we've been all over the place. People just read books and talk about them and come out in the public. But somehow we're like embarrassed in this country to like think deeply about ideas. We all need talking points. Like you wanted to know why we wanted the questions in advance, not because we didn't write the book, but because we like to actually think again about the question and learn something new every time we're speaking. So I think, to get back to the question, that we need to actually allow school to be about thinking. Which we don't do. That's why CRT is under attack. That's why so many of the ways that the university curricula have been transformed is under attack, because it was all about introducing critical thinking. And this has not been a recent attack. I had a professor that I love very much, Edward Said, many years ago. Some of you may know. And he taught us a whole class in the 1990s about the right's attack on the university and how think tanks were being organized to address what they perceived as the threat, fundamentally, to their way of living, which was our changing the university's curriculum and including different kinds of people. So one of the reasons that it's not a great equalizer is because we're not being taught anything that's useful anymore. They're trying to prevent us from knowing anything that could actually be useful. On the other hand, I will say, as someone who's politically engaged, I don't like it when my students come to class and say, day one in a law class, can we talk about abolition? I'm like, we'll get to that. First, I want to teach you how to look up legal cases. I want to teach you all kinds of other skills that you're going to need, because the rally speech is not going to get you to the revolution. So schools we want little kids to be able to be, critically engage with each other. And this is why they're going after this curriculum, and we have to fight it. But we have to fight it by knowing it's not about just a position, but it's about a way of being in the world, of being curious, of being connected to the rest of the world.
Yes, you may, of course.
Okay, I want to add another dimension to this conversation. Some 10 years ago, we went to Palestine. And I want to acknowledge that much of our thinking about the carcerality of this country owes a great deal to both the experiences and the ideas we encountered in Palestine, where virtually everyone in Palestine Palestine has either been to prison or has a family member who has been to prison. But we're talking about education. And the reason I thought about the example of Palestine is that virtually everyone we met valued education in a way that is unimaginable in this country. As a matter of fact, when the university was shut down as a result of attacks by the Israeli occupying force, and especially during the Intifada, classes still took place. They happened in homes, they happened in restaurants, they happened in bars. And I think the literacy rate in Palestine is something like 95 or 96%. Everybody there. And one of the reasons why Palestine is so demonized is because of the fact that we can learn so much from the ways in which Palestinian people have resisted the occupation. And so I just want to point out that our book also owes a great deal to the understanding of the relationship between imprisonment and policing and the struggle for a better world. We could do an entire conversation about this, but I didn't want the conversation to close without asking us to reflect deeply about the experiences of people who are not from the U.S., who do not live in the U.S. We have such a U.S.-centric way of living and thinking that we can't manage to open ourselves up. And let me just say one other thing, April, because I'm thinking about your book, and in the course of doing this work, we encountered 11 years ago, this young woman by the name of Francia Marquez in Colombia. And she was fighting passionately to defend her people. We visited her ancestral visit that was under attack by the government that wanted to issue permits to international mining concerns to come and literally cut off the top of the mountain where they lived in order to mine for gold. Okay, this young woman was determined to prevent the eviction of her people from their land, which they had been inhabiting for some 400 years. They were the first Maroon community in Colombia, in the Americas. And today, Francia Marquez is the vice president of Colombia. So she should be in your book.
Maybe I go to Colombia and meet with her. I know where it is, not Columbia, Maryland. Oh my God. Andy Shalal, come on. So, but with this global view, and it's unfortunate, in some of our communities, I'm from Baltimore, they used to say many of us don't get beyond a 10-block radius. It's unfortunate, but it's true. I travel back and forth between DC and Baltimore, so I broke that stereotype every day. But what is the worst prison system in the world that you have seen? Wait a minute, are you trying to say the United States?
Well, we don't
Wow.
we don't rank. So here's another way of answering your question.
No, Dr. Davis was like
No.
this.
Well, you could say us. I mean, there are lots of reasons you could use the U.S. We can talk about the rate of incarceration, the raciality of incarceration. We could go on and get on about it. But I think that's not usually where we go, because one of the problems, and especially a feminist problem, is what they have called historically the pinking of the prisons. In other words, if you make prettier, cleaner, prisons with like more programs in them. So let's say people are having trouble raising their kids or having drug issues or whatever. The more we build prisons that do more things and have more functions, the more we've expanded the footprint of the prison system. And even if those prisons are prettier, the lack of liberty and the consequences of incarceration and the consequences to families and the consequences to communities are the same. So one thing we don't want to do usually is compare, what kind of systems. We often use comparisons, like when people talk about Scandinavia and they say, what about countries that are devoted to decarceration, where they actually have a system where they're trying to get people out of prison rather than give them longer sentences? Or what about places that don't provide any kind of access? We were in a prison in Argentina some 20 years ago, and actually I think both of us, having been to many, were very shocked. Because Argentina, if you just look down on the street, you'll see people who are mostly light-skinned, but when you went inside the jails, as in every other place we've been in prisons in the world, you see darker people. So we could talk about those, but I think what's really important is that the carcerality that it surrounds us is especially in the things that are offered to us as safety. We need to redefine that safety and go for something that really is substantively about lack of harm.
Right. And in that context, when we rank carcerally the worst, I want to also rank carcerally the best in holistic approaches. Because it is important, because this book kind of brings a call to action to a certain extent. And when you bring a call to action, people want to know, what am I fighting for? So that's why we rank what's worst, what's the best. What's the best in the holistic
But one of the really important points I think we try to make in the book is that we do not want better prisons. If we look at the history of the institution of the prison itself, there have always been struggles for better, less repressive prisons. And those struggles have often been successful. But in the final analysis, those new prisons have turned out to be even more repressive and even more racist and even worse than the ones against which people were fighting. So, and there's an example that I think might be helpful, April, that I want to share, and that is, remember when Schwarzenegger was governor of California? He was the governor that we used to call him. You remember that? Okay, so he came up with this idea that one of the major problems of the California prison system would be solved by vacating, one of the women's prisons. There were 2 women's prisons in Chowchilla, California, across the street from each other, that were the largest women's prisons in the entire world. So what he suggested was that we needed community-based, gender-responsive prisons. Now, and that's a very interesting story, how it unfolded, because eventually women in those prisons organized against the idea of new gender-responsive prisons. Not because it wouldn't have been better for but some of the individuals to be in communities that would be closer to their family and to be in smaller institutions, but because they knew that this was expanding the footprint of the prison. And so that not only would they have these small prisons in who knows where, but they would probably have 1,000 small prisons, or they would have more women's prisons. Anyway, this is one of the examples we use in the book of the way in which people in prison themselves have the insight to recognize that even though it may be against their own best individual interests, It was in the interest of the society as a whole to stop the proliferation of prisons, whatever kind of prisons you're talking about.
And pay attention to what's happening in New York right now around Rikers Island. Because the same thing is being attempted in New York. We know how, I think we all know how awful Rikers Island is. I will not say one good thing about Rikers Island. However, the plans to build, for example, in Harlem, a women's prison that is close to community, which of course solves some of the problems. Let's list them. People being too far from their loved ones. It's hard to get all the way to these places. Unsafe conditions in Rikers Island. I mean, we could go on and on about the problems. However, the idea of this new fancy prison in the middle of Harlem, because of course Harlemites are going to need to keep going to prison, which is the message.
Exactly. For those of you who don't know, Harlem is predominantly black, and they've even tried to change the name of Harlem to Uptown. I was very upset when I heard that. Trying to take from us what is us. Well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, just to make people, because we want to also get people to know some of the active campaigns that are going on. And this is actually, it's hard, we don't have enough time, but this is a really complicated question. Because, for example, we work with a lot of people who are formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated who don't want to identify as abolitionists. And we work with those people because we share a lot of the same goals, but for people who've been inside often, they have experienced things from others inside that make them afraid of full abolition. The same could be said about this plan to build the jail in Harlem. It does have the support of a lot of people who've been suffering in a variety of ways, and we want to acknowledge that. I'm not trying to wipe that away. But I do want to say that the conversation needs to be not an either or, Rikers Island or fancy new prison in Harlem. We have to get to another conversation. Otherwise, we're stuck in reform and we'll be doing reform for centuries, and our people are going to continue to suffer.
And so just to briefly add to that, the conversation is about a feminist jail. A feminist jail. That's an oxymoron. And I just want to say that Mariam Cambas, whom I'm sure many of you have read, once said, jail is not feminist. Prison is not feminist. And so this is the way we're asked to become a part of projects that are actually going to accomplish the opposite of what we think that we're doing. So we have to be very careful about that.
So we're supposed to wrap up, but we have time for one more question. This has been such a wonderful conversation, hasn't it been? Yes. It makes you rethink what is in your face, from feminism, gender violence, the prison system, all of the above, immigration, the world scope of the carceral system. But here's the last question. Someone got a little spicy in this audience. Black people experience slavery and racial hatred as a people. Black women, men, children were and are victims as a whole, a group. To what extent, if any, does centering on women rather than the whole group affect the overall effort of the group to advance?
Oh, that's easy.
That's easy, okay.
Yeah, let me just say this. Black women, women generally, but especially Black women have been behind every major struggle for change in our history. And if anybody knows anything about Black women, it's that Black women never fight only for themselves. It's always for other people.
Community. community. We fight for community.
Yes, and that is why we say when black women rise, the entire world rises with us.
If I was in church, I'd be running around the building. I'd be throwing my $10 at the front. You just said a word, Dr. Davis. Whew. Did you hear that to that spicy person who asked that question? I hope you felt it in your bones, because I sure did. I'm gonna walk home saying, I lift the community, daggone it. I'm a black woman.
Not just the community, but all people.
All people, that's
All
right. I'm a
people.
black woman, says Dr. Dent
And
Dr.
non-humans.
Davis.
But I hate to go after that. That's just like a terrible, terrible thing I'm doing now. But I just want to say though, because I think that people still get confused about this term feminist.
Give us a definition too.
I think the easier way to say it is, if you think about the sum total of things we've been saying tonight, some of them which were specifically about gender, some of them which were about policing in general, some of them which are about ways of thinking, all of that is what we consider to be feminist. It isn't for women or even always by women. We're talking about the way gender is structuring everything we do, and the way that a feminist analysis is a different way of being with questions, and a different way of being in movements, and a different way of thinking about how we repair. So, yeah, but all of the social problems that we have. Angela's coaching me, Ray's class. I mean, I know. This is how it goes all the time. But I think it's really important for us to emphasize that we lifted up people in this book because we're talking about hundreds of years as well who don't have the label feminist. We're also lifting up people who don't identify as women. We're also breaking down these categories. The important part, though, and the reason we use the word feminism is because there are substantial differences that are against a masculinist point of view and a masculinist way of thinking, and the social order that we have, which values certain ways of expressing ourselves, certain ways of being organized, certain ways of thinking about leadership, certain ways of thinking about what knowledge is. And these are the things that have been built by communities of feminists, including women, for hundreds of years and keep getting suppressed. So we believe a healthier way of thinking about abolition, a more holistic way, to bring back to your term, is to invite all of us to be a part of that feminism. Whether you use the label or not, think through questions in a holistic way. Always think intersectionally, not about identities, because that's what intersectionality has turned into, but about structures and struggles.
I encourage you, if you have not already, receive this book, embrace it, engage with it. Go buy the book. Abolition, Feminism Now by Dr. Angela Y. Davis, Dr. Gina Dent, Dr. Erica R. Miners, and Dr. Beth E. Ritchie. Thank you so much, guys, for this great conversation. Let's give them a big round of applause. This was awesome. Busboys and Poets, you got it tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all so much for coming. It's really an honor to have you all here. We have just a couple more housekeeping things, if you don't mind. Stay put where you are. We want to take a picture. There's a Getty photography here, and they want you to hold up the book, up in the air, the book that you purchased, whatever book you have. Everyone, please hold up the book. We're going to take a group photo. Would you guys be able to stand in front of this? Yeah.
Here?
Thank you. Also, your earphone. Yeah, please. Here.
Okay, let me take my mask off.
I'll hold that for you. Hold my hand.
Salute. my book in. Oh.
803 guys. 1, 2, 3. Good job. Nice.
You all look so beautiful. How you doing back there, Brian?
Thank you very much. So please stay seated for a moment so we can take our guests over to the signing room. And then Lori here is our book manager. Please give her a hand, Lori, our book manager. And she'll tell you some instructions.
Thank you, everyone. I've been very, very low-key tonight, but thank you. I love the applause. So please go ahead and take a seat once more. We